Today we're talking about Milton's Lycidas, which was, I suppose, for about 400 years the most famous elegy in English.
It still is, isn't it? I mean, it is the most extraordinary poem, and I suppose in terms of classifying it in relation to elegy and some of the categories we'll be looking at, it's an elegy for another poet, because Edward King, who is the original of Lycidas, did publish about 10 poems in Latin, one celebrating kind of royalist events, which, of course, Milton is famous as a puritan and an anti-royalist. But he does present Lycidas in this poem as a fellow poet. So, but it's also a pastoral elegy, and the tradition of pastoral and elegy is immensely kind of interesting and complex, and derives back to such as Theocritus and Bion and Moschius.
We're talking really old. We're talking like 3rd century BC.
3rd century BC, and no one knows exactly who they were, but they were all kind of channeled by Virgil in his eclogues, and most of the footnotes that you'll find to Lycidas refer to Virgil's eclogues. So Milton, who was one of the most kind of well-read in a number of languages, but particularly in the classics, poets of all time, is channeling a tradition that stretches back many centuries. But in particular, he is also channeling Spenser, who in the Shepherd's Calendar and Astrophel for Sir Philip Sidney writes pastoral elegies. And so the alliance of the pastoral and the lament for somebody who's died is very, very venerable, and had rather died out by the time that Milton wrote Lycidas.
We should make that quite clear, that point, shouldn't we? So Edward King is a fellow of Christ's College in Cambridge, which is Milton's college. And he's drowned in August 1637 on his way to Ireland, where he's going to be a priest. He's going to spread the good news about Anglicanism.
Yes, and he was from Ireland. I mean, he had Irish relatives as well.
And the memorial volume that is produced for him, which in English is Obsequies for Edward King, Lost at Sea, written by his sorrowful friends in love and remembrance, comes out the next year. And most of the poems are in Greek and Latin, aren't they? There's a few in English, and Lycidas is one of those, the last one in the book. But it's the only one to adopt this, in some senses, quite old-fashioned pastoral mode. The other ones don't do that.
No, they were more kind of metaphysical. They were more influenced by John Donne.
You should say something about the pastoral mode, shouldn't we? It's a very, I mean, for modern readers, it's very peculiar mode in which highly educated people pretend to be unlettered shepherds talking to each other about, you know, their often frustrated love life or losses that they've encountered, while at the same time referring to the handling of sheep.
Yes, I mean, it reaches its apogee, I suppose, in Marie Antoinette, milking cows into Sèvres milk churns and so on. So it is an aristocratic form in such as You Like It would be an example our listeners will know of courtly people going into the country and pretending to be shepherds. But yes, pastoral was really central to Spenser's innovations in poetry, and Milton was very influenced by Spenser, and the idea that the shepherd it has a kind of pastoral, almost religious significance, and that's true actually of the classical genre as well. And the gods can appear in it, like Phoebus appears in Virgil's eclogues as he appears. And it's worth saying that they are often eclogues; they're dialogues between different characters. And Lycidas makes really extraordinary and brilliant use of Phoebus and also St. Peter, basically, to interject a kind of responses to what the poet is complaining about, so that they do have that to and fro, and that does derive from the classical tradition.
So it isn't in its origins a pagan literary form. Milton obviously is as far from being a pagan as you could be, and I suppose the thing that connects the pagan and the Christian is the idea of Christ as being a shepherd, and therefore, by analogy, the minister of the church being a shepherd to the flock that he's looking after.
That's the large-scale sort of analogy, yes. And both King and Milton were thinking of taking religious orders. Well, King was going to. Milton was thinking about it, but he changed his mind and decided to become the greatest poet in the English language instead, and to justify the ways of God to men in his poetry rather than in church services. And of course, he was also in dispute with the dominant religious hierarchy of the time. And as an elegy, some of our listeners who don't know it may be surprised when we come across a really quite virulent attack on the clergy right in the middle of the poem.
Yes.
And this, in terms of the context, was part of Charles I's a leaning towards kind of popery as the Puritans saw it, and in particularly Archbishop Laud's new instructions, and they were quite violent and quite brutal, and nearly all commentators on the poem allude to a moment in June of 1637 when three Puritans, John Bastwick, Henry Burton and William Prynne, had their ears lopped off, and ears do feature in the poem. William Prynne, poor bloke, had already had his ears lopped off, so they had to take away the stumps of his ears, and he was brandished SL, seditious libeller, and that was part of a wave of anti-Puritan attacks. And that may have been as important as the genesis for the poem as the death of Edward King, that these two things kind of come together in the poem. So in an odd way, unlike Paradise Lost, it's a very topical poem. It's one that is connected to particular occasions.
Yes, and as the preface to the volume of obsequies makes clear, King is being held up here as a kind of exemplarily pious person. So the shipwreck is described, and the preface says, this is a translation because the preface is written in Latin, but the preface describes the way that while the other passengers were busy running around the ship trying to save their lives, King fell to his knees and prayed and sank into the waves with the vessel. In a kind of passive and accepting way. So he becomes an absolute kind of exemplification of Christian duty.
I didn't know that. That looks forward to the nuns in Hopkins's The Wreck of the Deutschland, doesn't it?
It does indeed. It does indeed. Okay, so before we plunge into the poem, let's have one last look back at Spenser, his precursor in pastoral. So the Shepherd's Calendar does the same pastoral thing, which is that if you describe in full detail, I'm paraphrasing William Empson, who wrote the greatest book about pastoral that there is, that if you describe in full detail the life of very simple people, like shepherds, then in a way you are describing the life of much more complicated people, like you and me, and people who've been to Christ's College, Cambridge, and that sort of thing. So there's that aspect to it. But there's also a stylistic aspect to it, isn't there? So Spenser is fond of introducing into the Shepherd's Calendar words that feel a little bit like dialect, like English kind of rural or rustic words, like the words that Milton introduces, like crow-toe and daffodillies and oaten pipes and all that kind of stuff. So pastoral's at once a thematic thing, but also a stylistic decision that Milton's taking here.
Yes, but it's also extremely cosmopolitan, and the verse forms, such as we can tell, that were influencing Milton, not only classical pastoral, but Italian canzoni. I mean, he read every language there was, but Italian canzoni, and he goes to Italy the year after, doesn't he? And so this is an amazingly inventive and original poem. Formally it's got 10 unrhymed lines. I mean, there's no precedent really for what he does in it. 10 unrhymed lines. It's got 14 six-syllable lines, and most of them are iambic pentameter, but some are 6 syllables. So there's something rather kind of experimental and innovative about it. So on the one hand, this is typical of Milton, one foot in the tradition, and there is no one. T.S. Eliot is the only possible competitor, as saturated in the traditions of poetry and percolating through all his work as Milton. On the other hand, like Eliot, he is always experimenting and creating new forms, particularly in Lycidas. And I think it's worth saying that by this time he had decided that his vocation was to be the great poet-prophet, the epic poet of both Englishness and of Christian Englishness in particular. And to become that, he felt he had to dedicate himself to kinds of learning that just do your head in terms of the numbers of languages he learns, the philosophy he reads. And he'd spent sort of 5 or 6 years just in private study. And his dad was saying a little bit, John, you're going to get a job at some time? And he was saying, no, there's a Latin elegy, ad patrem, to his father, in which he says his father didn't like poetry, but that he was going to, he had to do this apprentice work. So the whole point of the opening of the poem is that he's not quite ready to venture into poetry, that he hasn't done enough research, enough training, although he has published things like the Nativity Ode and various other occasional pieces, that at the beginning he's presenting himself as forced, and it's a brilliant notion, forced into writing this poem by overwhelming emotion.
By the sheer grief of the occasion, yes, exactly.
And the fact he didn't know Edward King very well, or people don't know quite how well he knew him, but he was 4 years older. They were both at Christ's College, Cambridge, but it's not known the extent of their friendship. So to what extent it's an exercise, and Samuel Johnson criticised the poem quite heavily for being in some ways artificial as he saw it, where there is leisure for fiction, there is little grief, he said, which seems to me completely wrong, where grief can inspire fiction as much as truthfulness. But it was part of an ongoing denunciation of the poem by Johnson.
Yeah.
But we won't sort of get into that, just to say that the opening conceit is that here is this poet who is quietly developing himself, ready to write his great opus, and suddenly the death of Edward King, he learns of that, and he's forced to write this elegy.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription. Go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.